significance of Ahmadiyya, what it stands for, right? You see, in every group which forms large numbers of following, there has to be a title to distinguish their way of life, their thinking, their doctrines, etc., so that every time you introduce one of the members to anybody else, they don't have to go into detail of what he believes and what he does not believe in. So that is why the various sects in all religions have been given titles. Some people are against titles, against sectarianism. I am also against sectarianism. But the titles do not create sects. When the sects are already created, you can't do away with titles. They have to be there. Otherwise it will involve you in very longish explanation as to who somebody is. So Ahmadiyya stands for those people in Islam who believe that the prophecies of the founder of Islam regarding the reformer of the latter day have been fulfilled. That promised reformer has come. And as such, from the Muslim perspective, it's so clear that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, promised them that a guided man would come, a leader who would be guided, which stands for Al-Imam al-Mahdi, the leader who is created by God and is guided by God. So that is one title given to the promised reformer of the latter day by the holy founder of Islam 1400 years ago. The second title is Al-Masih al-Ma'ud, the promised Messiah. And it is here that Ahmadis are very closely related with the Christians and Jews as well. Because the concept of Messiah is common among these three big religions. The only difference being that the Jews believe that the Messiah did not appear in the first instance. They are still awaiting his advent. But they do believe that Messiah is very important. The world cannot be redeemed without his advent. That is what their official belief should be, and still is. The Christians believe he did come, of course. So as far as the concept of Messiah and redemption is concerned, there is no disagreement. Only the disagreement is regarding whether he has come or not. But the Christians also believe that before leaving the world, the Messiah himself promised that he would return again, say a second visit. So they are still now in the same boat as Jews, in a manner of speaking. Both are awaiting. One is awaiting the first advent, the others are awaiting the second advent. Muslims also believe, and this is a very interesting part of the story, that the holy founder of Islam also predicted that a Messiah would come and it would be the same Messiah. You see, referring to the historic Messiah of Christianity, he said he would come again, but in Islam. So the agreement is on his coming. The disagreement is that Jews believe that when he would come, he would uphold the Jewish ideology and he will condemn all the rest to hell. I mean, this is what they don't say in so many words because they're decent, but this is what they have to believe in. The Christians believe he would come to usher a new era of global victory for Christianity. He would come in glory and with pageantry. This time it won't be a humble appearance in a small village like Nazareth. This time it's going to be a great majestic appearance with a flourish, and no one on earth would be able to reject that new advent. But of course he would be Christian. Muslims say no. He would come, of course, again from heaven, bodily from heaven, but this time he will get converted to Islam himself, and he will fight Christianity rather than support Christianity. Because according to Islamic belief, Christianity of today has deviated from the path of the Messiah. They believe that he was a monotheist, he worshipped God, never asked anybody to worship him himself. So he's going to rectify the wrongs done in his name by the people of the following century. So in that respect, he would become a Muslim, and he would say the procession of prophets which came along the line of Israel was ended with Prophet Muhammad. He is the fruit of the same tree. Join us, forget about differences, and believe in one God. The only problem with that concept is that they believe the same Messiah who appeared around 1900 some years before, he would reappear in person. Ahmadis also believe, now I'm coming to the last part. I had to explain all these things because you didn't know the ABC, that is why I took so long. Ahmadis agree with the concept of Messiah and the question of redemption being associated with him. Ahmadis believe that the entire world, the fate of the entire world, hangs in balance only with the question of Messiah's coming or not coming. So we believe that he has to come, but how? Would he repeat a personal visit? Would he come from somewhere in space, bodily? Or would he be represented spiritually or in character by somebody born of humble origin, like he himself came first time? So will he repeat the recipe which he brought for the first time, or will he consider it having failed and would try a second recipe this time? We believe no, it has not failed. That was the recipe for the world. If he changes the recipe, it would be wrong, because the faith always begins with humility. It always invites people to the path of sacrifices. They go through the mill of persecution, and it is that which purifies them. It is that which reforms them. If somebody is sent by God in glory and pageantry, every Tom, Dick and Harry will follow him. There is no question of the trial of faith, no question of one's purification anymore. So they will receive the worldly material gains from their belief, and everybody would rush. In fact, the bad ones would rush forward. Like in a situation where something is being distributed and there is no queue, everybody rushes. It's always the evil one who reaches the first, reaches the food first, indisciplined one. The gentleman sometimes keeps staying back until the crowd has been fed for, and whatever is left over is offered to gentlemen. So how on earth could God use that formula? We can't understand as Ahmadis. So what we believe is that Jesus was to come in second advent as he came earlier, unrecognized, humble, appearing from nowhere, and people rejecting him out of their arrogance and out of their self-styled knowledge and wisdom and things. And they say, what is this man, small thing? How could he be from God? So that is how he is going to appear again, but not in person. So this is what Ahmadi means. But the question of person, when it comes to a debate, then we request all others who disagree with us to take this dispute to the court of Jesus Christ himself, to none other. Let him decide. Everybody is surprised, he is no longer here. How can we take this case? We say it's just a manner of speaking. It is a custom in law that if a higher court has given its verdict in a similar situation, when the same situation arises again, the same verdict is applicable. No lower court can disagree with that. So we point out that Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, once sat on judgment on a similar dispute. He gave his verdict once and for all, and we go by his verdict. Those who claim they are Christians, it's up to them to go by his verdict or disagree with his verdict. The dispute was about Elijah, or Elijah, the promised one who, according to the Old Testament, had ascended to heaven bodily, sitting on a chariot, with all these details. Visibly, materially, according to the New Old Testament, he had gone up. So it was said that Messiah would not come until he returned. He would come first, declare to the world that the coming of the Messiah is close by, prepare yourself, open up your heart. And when this happens, then Messiah would appear. Everybody knows this. Every Christian, every Jew is agreed on this issue. No disagreement. So when Messiah claimed to be the Messiah, they started mocking, joking with his followers, his disciples, said, all right, we'll believe, but first is first. Produce Elijah first from heaven. Show us where he is. Then we'll believe in Messiah. You can't believe in a child whose mother is not born. It's impossible. When this matter was referred to Jesus Christ, the New Testament gives the evidence that not pointing with finger, but meaning John the Baptist. He said, he is the Elijah who was to descend from heaven. Take it or not. It's entirely up to you. What a decision of profound wisdom, universal wisdom. The only key to understanding similar situations. So we say that why don't you follow his judgment? If this happens in the world, in the religious world, then this is a key to understanding the phenomenon or the jargon of religious terminology. So we point out that now we understand through Jesus Christ's explanation that why we see all over the world similar stories. People having gone to heaven and people are waiting for them. None has seen anyone returning physically. Yet those who predicted were holy men, founders of great religion. How could this be false? So we point out that thanks to Jesus Christ, now we understand what the meaning was. When you say somebody would return from heaven, it means he would come from God, but not dangling bodily from space, but reappearing among you, repeating the same story all over again, which was repeated throughout the human history when prophets came to them. So we say we believe in this understanding of Jesus' return, and we believe he has come in the person of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. So that is the meaning of Ahmadiyya community. So whenever you hear this word in future, just one word would convey to you all that I have told and some more things as well. Right? Good. Anything else, please? Any other questions? Yes, please. Yes? Your name is, please? Yes? Right. Okay. I would certainly like to share with you my view of hell and heaven, which is based on the Holy Quran. On this issue, of course, I'll answer you, but I request you to read a book written by the founder of the Ahmadiyya community, to whom we refer as the Promised Messiah. Once 5 such questions were put to scholars from various religions, and they were invited in a conference to give answers according to their scriptures. One of these was this, and he dealt with this question in a most beautiful and satisfying way, as we understand, because the verdict of all the participants in the end was that his understanding was the best and most satisfying. I'll give you a specimen of that here only shortly. He said that hell and heaven are spiritual concepts because when we die, we leave the body behind and it rots, dust to dust, returns, and that is all there is left of the body. The soul continues to live in a spiritual form of energy, like a package of energy. Now the scientists refer to that packet of energy as Silton, is it? Some physicists would correct me if I'm wrong. Huh? No, not proton. A package of energy which lives as a bundle of energy with independent entity and identity. It's called Silton or something like that, you know. Huh? No, please, for God's sake. It is something like Silton, L-T-O-N-R in that, but I don't know exactly whether it is pronounced this or with slight variation. The concept, let me first explain, otherwise you will not understand the concept of the soul either. The concept is, it began with an accident. Only after the turn of the century, somebody was walking along, tugging along his boat along the river bank, and the boat was leaving a pattern of waves behind, which are created behind, but it does never go ahead of the boat. Never goes ahead of the boat. This is impossible. I mean, until that time it was considered impossible. So you see, always when you walk the water, a trail is left behind you, but it goes on and on, but it's always behind you. It does not move along, passing you and leaving you behind. At a turn of a corner, suddenly he saw that the boat stopped, but this continued. So this was taken note of by some physicists. They had thought that it is impossible. But when they repeated the experiment in the same conditions, they found that it happened. So then the new concept is born, that previously it was thought that waves go on traveling freely. They don't live in a organized way as a bundle of energy. So from this point they realized that the waves the energy can live in a form, organized form of a bundle of energy. From this they have started putting this to usage in most ultra-modern computers. Japan has taken the lead in this. They are now being able to create those small bundles of energy, and this unleashed the debate about the concept of soul. And many physicists, one of them is Nobel laureate, have begun to agree with the people of religion, and he says that previously we pooh-poohed the idea of soul because we could not conceive any energy living with its own identity of internal formation separately. And now we have seen, we have put it to usage. So maybe the soul is something which leaves the body and has acquired its own identity, an entity and a form and so on. So that is what I am referring to. Having understood this, Hazrat Mirza Sahib, although he had no knowledge of such things, basing his concept on the Holy Quran, said that whenever we live here, we always make or unmake our soul with every decision we make. Some decisions are ugly, some decisions are beautiful. Every day, right from the morning till the end, we are always confronted with two choices, this or that, this or that. And we always make choices. So when we make wrong choices, then we know, if we are conscious at that moment, we can know that this was a wrong choice, it left something bad, a blemish on our soul or personality, which you can call it. So the personality becomes uglier, uglier, and or beautiful and more beautiful. That is the difference between those people who commit crimes and live in crime and while the time away in pursuit of vain luxury. You look at them and you see there is something different in their eyes, in their expressions. They're not just those people who are true, who are humble, who serve others, who do goodness. So, having discussed this, he said that at the time of death, these souls are released. And then, despite the fact that the circumstances may be the same exactly, one would suffer and one would enjoy. The example he gave was that if somebody is very hungry and also very thirsty and also feels very hot, that is the time when just liquid will not do or just food will not do. He wants something, a mixture of all these things which can satisfy all his wants. So a grape of chilled, a bunch of chilled grapes, if it is offered to such a person, it will provide water, it will provide energy, it will provide the coolness he requires. That would create a sort of heaven for him. He would enjoy it so thoroughly. Another person is suffering from debilitating diarrhea and vomiting, and he is completely dehydrated. He wants energy, he wants water, he wants coolness as well. But offer him a bunch of cooled a bunch of what we say, what is it? Grapes or anything. I mean, any fruit which is cooled and which is delicious looking and smells nice and it satisfies one, offer him, and he would react violently. He says, remove it. I feel nauseated with it. I feel like vomiting. And if some stupid mothers insist sometimes to the child, no, please have one for my sake, they sometimes like to, smash the faces. Get away, go your way, don't come to us again, don't bring this torture to us. The same thing, apparently the same situation, the same needs, yet the same situation creates hell for some and heaven for others. So he said, those who are used to love of God, those who acquire the taste for good things, all their lives they have been doing this, serving mankind and beginning to enjoy goodness. When they die, the goodness will be brought closer to them. And it will be, in a manner far more intensified. That is the vision of God, otherwise you can't see God at all. So when your dream comes true, it is realized, when what you see from far off comes closer to you, that is heaven for you. You enjoy it so thoroughly. But when a person who is fed up of these things in this world, whose soul is trained for other pleasures, if he is brought closer to such goodness, it will create hell for him. Now, he didn't say that, but I'm adding to that. In everyday experience, those who are given to pop music and all such, ugly films, which some people look say very lovely films, if on the television suddenly there is program of Bible alone, or the Holy Quran or Gita is read, and nothing of the pop music is heard, and nothing of the ugly scenes which they call lovely scenes are shown on the television, that would be hell for them. They would smash their televisions. They would march in protest against the television station. They say, what is this nonsense? Yet those who love God, who genuinely love goodness, they would enjoy watching the television. They would thank God that nonsense is over. Right? So hell and heaven is in the same space, same time space. Now when you read the Holy Quran, and he based, of course, all these observations on the Quran, you read that the heaven is so large that arduha samawati wal ard, its expanse is the entire expanse of the universe. Now, when this verse was revealed 1400 years ago, some of the companions of the Holy Founder of Islam inquired from him, said, what do you say? Where is the hell? If in the entire universe is covered by heaven, then where the hell would be? As they say, where the hell would be, you know? So the answer was, the same place. You don't know, you don't understand these things. So he's talking of many more dimensions. This is why we believe he was true. He was talking things of pertaining to time which had not yet started taking shape. 1400 years ago, nobody could think of more than 3 dimensions. Then came the 4, the time, space and things, and now they're multiplied by scientists to 14, and even 28 is being talked about. So that is what he said. It would be the same time, space, but you don't understand these things. It's impossible for you to understand. So that is the concept of heaven and hell. You create step by step, by each decision you take and each implementation you make after the decision, your own hell or your own heaven. Ugly souls are born, deficit souls are born, healthy souls are born, beautiful souls are born at the time of death. And then a new story begins, like the delivery of the child, and he takes the flight into a new life. Thank you.
In other words, what you are mentioning is that the concept of hell and heaven is as long as the person is alive, not after death.
No, no.
Or after death, then how a soul, what you have described as a bundle of energy, then where is the concept of reward and punishment for that bundle of energy?
I thought I had explained. I'm sorry.
I didn't get that.
I couldn't. Yes, please. I hope most of you did get I could put myself across. I'll explain for your sake further. Somewhere you missed a turn and then you couldn't tag along me. The fact is, what I was telling you in 2 parts. First part, what you learn to live here is what you face after death. You relive what you have lived here more intensely. So body connected with soul gives you certain pleasures. The pleasures can be born out of goodness or out of evil. But it is not the body really who enjoys, it is the soul, the mind as it is called by some scientists. So when the contact is severed, it lives as a bundle of energy. But with having brought closer to existence of God, to the presence of God, which a good religious person always sought. And when he remembered God, when he called him, "Oh my provider, oh the most beneficent, oh the one who repeats his kindness to people and repeats on and on, one who always treats us with mercy, who forgives sins, who does this, does that, who has created the entire universe, is so complicated, with such wisdom." Now when you talk of God, you have an understanding, of course, and you enjoy that if you are a good man. But that understanding is something like you are seeing something in a dream. Sometimes in dreams also you wake up and see the daylight. But when you really wake up, that is the real enjoyment. That is the real encounter of daylight. So something like that is going to happen. The beauty of God, which you enjoy from some distance, is brought closer to you after death. And then you see your beloved come closer. And that creates your heaven, and you begin the process of developing your contact with God continuously, forever. This is the concept which the founder of the Ahmadiyya community gave with reference to the verses of the Holy Quran. So if anybody wants to know where it is said and why it is said and how did he infer that, he has to refer to the book, please. Now, have I made myself clear? Thank you. Yes, please. One sound. Yes.
My question refers to halal, haram.
Right.
I was told that everything that is kosher is supposed to be halal to Muslims. Now, among Jewish people,
Please.
drinking wine at the time of
Excuse me.
Passover,
Just a moment. Yes, please. Yes.
among Jewish people drinking wine at the time of Passover is a religious ritual. So I have said that's not accepted in Islam. Could you comment on the relationship between the halal, haram, and kosher?
Yes, I think it's very simple. Halal does not mean that what is haram becomes halal the way you prepare it. That is the misunderstanding perhaps you're entertaining. For instance, if if an animal is considered halal in the sense that you can eat its meat, then there are ways of slaughtering it. Some ways can make it haram despite the fact that it is potentially halal, potentially permissible to eat. But the way you kill the animal can also make it haram despite the fact that potentially it is halal or permissible. So halal, the concept of halal only applies to such animals or such commodities which basically potentially are halal. But if they are forbidden, then no manner of slaughtering them or saying words of God can ever make them halal for anybody. You understand this point? So when you speak of kosher being halal, we only mean that whatever is potentially halal, if Jews prepare it, it is permissible for Muslims to eat it without the slightest hesitation. But that is not all. Ahmadiyya understanding of halal haram is not as rigid as some orthodox Muslims would have you believe. We believe, and again with reference to the hadith and the Quran, that any animal whose blood is let, who is killed with the purpose of feeding human beings, not to destroy, but this purpose, even if God's name is not recited over there in the manner the Jews and the Muslims do, if you say Allah's name before eating that meat, it still is halal, because all the conditions of halal are met with. The only condition which is not met with is that Allah's name was not recited before the slaughter. But we have learned from the holy founder of Islam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, that if a meat is brought to you which was not slaughtered for idols and things, that is haram of course, which is neutral meat, let's call it. If you say Bismillah, Allahu Akbar and eat it, it's okay. The philosophy of Bismillah, Allahu Akbar is only to remind you that you have no right to eat the flesh of living things except with the permission of God, who is the creator and who possesses the ultimate rights. So that is the reminder. That is the philosophy of the Jews and the Muslims, always saying the name of God before slaughtering an animal or even before eating. So this is the general concept of halal haram. Hope I have satisfied your query. Thank you.
In the same line from reference of Quran and Hadith, could you give your comments about use of alcohol for medicinal purposes?
Yes. You see, alcohol, first of all, it has to be defined. Alcohol is not mentioned in the Quran. All that intoxicates, that is mentioned. Now you understand the point. Now, if you have medicine prepared in alcohol. If you take it for the purpose of intoxication, it will rather kill you before it intoxicates you. It was mixed with so many medicines, chemicals, etc. So you cannot put it to wrong usage. It has only to be used for correct usage, which is not forbidden in Islam. Now, I'll further explain it. You take any medicine nowadays, not any, but many among them, particularly in homeopathy, almost all are prepared in alcohol. But when you use it, it is impossible for you to get intoxicated by the dosage which is safe for you. So you can't overdo it. And the definition of intoxication made by all the Muslim jurisprudence scholars is this, that if you eat or drink more of something and you get intoxicated, then it is forbidden. But because medicine cannot be taken in such quantity as can intoxicate, so we believe that it is not forbidden. That is one way of looking at the problem. Another way is with reference to a permission in the Holy Quran regarding the eating of flesh of pig. The Holy Quran says that if you are driven to such necessity as your life is in danger, then you are permitted even to eat the flesh of pig. So from this we draw the general principle that the sanctity of life stands above other things. And when God, who has forbidden us to eat certain things, himself permits us to eat that forbidden meat for the sake of saving life, then because medicine is just for that purpose. So applying this principle to medicine, if medicine does contain some elements of forbidden chemicals or things, because the intention is not bad, intention is not intoxication, so there is no harm in using medicine. That is why when we use it, we don't ever hesitate. We think we are within our jurisdiction to do that. Yes, please. After that gentleman. The microphone has gone over to that gentleman already. So after he is finished, I'll request you to bring the microphone to. Yes, please. Dua Islam. Just a moment, please. Your voice is not properly carried. Just wait for a moment. Yes, try again. The gentleman inquires two things. Number one, he says that non-Ahmadiyan, this is a wrong term, it should be non-Ahmadi Muslims. That is our terminology. But because he doesn't belong to our community, so he doesn't know the right term we use, but let's accept his term. Everybody has a right to coin a new term. So he says non-Ahmadiyan call Ahmadis non-Muslims. And so the Ahmadiyans also call non-Ahmadis non-Muslims. That is one thing. Secondly, we have got, because we are Muslims, so we have a visa to heaven. And perhaps Ahmadis do not have such visa to heaven. Is that the question? Okay, thank you. My answer, first of all, I put him a counter question. I requested him, where did he get the visa from? To get a visa, you require proper immigration of authorities. You can't get visas from anybody, like the Pakistanis nowadays are getting visas, fake visas, by paying money to somebody. So if, just a moment. What I am telling you is, this is exactly what is happening. Now I understand why the question of visa cropped up at all. Nowadays, it is so easy for Pakistanis to get visa to any Western country by paying some money and get a fake visa stamped on. So they think similar things will happen regarding our entry to heaven. We need some visa. I assure you, you do not need any visa for heaven. Or if you need, the only visa which will be valid will be the visa issued by the Holy Founder of Islam and the Quran. Without reference to the authority of the Quran and the verdict of the Holy Founder of Islam, no visa will be valid. So what the mullahs tell you is all hocus pocus. They have no authority. The Holy Quran does not give them the authority. Ask them, where have you got a visa from? Which verse of the Holy Quran? Which tradition of the Holy Prophet? Now I'll refer to a tradition which just applies to the question you have asked. Once the Holy Founder of Islam, addressing his companions, said that Jews earlier got divided into 72 sects. God has told me that so also my people, my ummah, would get divided into 72 sects. Then would come a Jama'ah, that would be 73rd. Now, to how many the visa to heaven is issued by the Holy Prophet in this context? This is the question. What he says, and all ulama agree, it's not an Ahmadiyya contention, all Ahmadis, all non-Ahmadi ulama agree. He said, all the 72 would be hell-bound, except the one which will be Al-Jama'ah. So the founder, the master of the Ummah, does not give visa to 72 sects. It only gives visa to one Jama'ah only, which is the 73rd. Who else has the authority to issue fake visas to the 72? None has. So the question is not, you're debating the issue with me. I'm nowhere. Debate the issue, if you dare, with the Holy Founder of Islam. Why did he say, being the master of the Ummah, that the 72 of the sects would be hellbound? Now, I would go deeper. The question was rather casual and superficial and slightly humorous as well, but I would take it more seriously. Let's delve deeper into the issue, go into the philosophy. The sects are born mostly by crooked approach of the leaders in religion. Otherwise the book is the same. The verdict of the Holy Founder is available to everybody. When you lose taqwa, that is the fear of Allah, then you are likely to split yourself and your people. So some people later on, when they saw things crookedly, because they themselves were crooked, they wanted license for themselves to do this and that. For instance, a mullah would like a license to possess a license to kill others in the name of God. So he would invent a meaning and attribute it to the Holy Quran, that according to the Holy Quran, whoever renounces Islam must be murdered immediately. Now, that is why mullah wants to play God. The Holy Quran doesn't say that. The Hadith doesn't say that. So he attributes this meaning to some verses of the Holy Quran which may be read like this by crooked people. And a sect is born. So 72 times wrong was done to the Holy Quran and the Prophet's word. That is why 72 sects were born. they were not right. If they were right, there would only be one Islam. This is the meaning why Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam predicted that of course it would be my ummah apparently, but the 72 of them, making the largest majority, would be hellbound. The question naturally followed that, O Prophet of Allah, how would we know that that one is the heaven-bound body and the rest are the 72? Put 73 eggs in a basket, apparently look the same, and tell somebody to, you must pick one, and we warn you that 72 are poisoned. You make a mistake and you die. This was the sort of dilemma which was faced by the people who understood this hadith in the same context. The answer, look at this, the beauty and the wisdom of the answer. He said, not at all difficult. When you find a people among Muslims who are being treated like you find me and my followers being treated, that would be the heaven-bound sect. The words were, Ma ana alayhi wa ashabi. The state in which you find me and my people today, if in that state a body of Muslims is found in that time of disputations, that has to be the right body. So a difficult question answered so beautifully, simply and understandably. No deeper knowledge of religion is required. You know how Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his followers were treated, don't you? Everybody knows. How was he treated? How were his followers treated? They were denied, number one, the right to profess kalima. They were dragged in the streets of Mecca and beaten up to sometimes pulp. They were burnt with heated up stones in the hot sun of Arabia. And all sorts of cruelties were committed to them. Many were murdered. What was the crime? They said, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. That was forbidden. Was it not forbidden? Right. No, my first answer is not finished, please. Then they were forbidden to say prayers. They were forbidden to call themselves Muslims. Do you know that? They were told you can call yourself Sabi, like we are called Mirzais or Qadianis. We are not provided the right to call ourselves what we call ourselves. That was exactly how the Muslims were treated at their time. Even Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallam was not permitted to call himself Muhammad, a name given him to by his parents. The Holy Quran bears witness to this, that everything was distorted about Islam, and you know what they called him? They called him Muzammam. They said, this is your name, we give you your name. They went to the extreme of forbidding them from saying Hajj, and they were forcibly prevented. Is that not the state in which the Muslims of the time of Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah were found? Answer me this, please. Am I right or wrong in painting this picture? I'm right. Now look at the entire history of Islam. Show me one single sect in Islam other than Ahmadiyya community which was treated exactly like this. There were differences between Shias and Sunnis, Wahhabis and Brelvis. They even killed each other. Rioted against each other. But none were deprived of the right of calling themselves Muslims. None were ever deprived of the right of saying kalima, of saying prayers. Show me when they were done. And they still go to the Hajj, and they were never prohibited from going to Hajj. So all that state in which you find Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallam has started reliving in Ahmadiyya community. The verdict is there. It's entirely up to you to decide. Now the second question, please. It's got cold, please. Yes? You see, that with one difference. Yes, with one difference. Let me explain. I'm going to tell you. But if you give me time, please. They were Khalifa to Hazrat Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Holy Master for all times to come. The last sovereign in Sharia, the last prophet whose word was never to be cancelled by anyone. So they were Khalifa to that person. I am a Khalifa to his slave. A slave who claimed that I am entirely subordinate to him in his Sharia and in his word. So with this difference, I am a Khalifa, of course, but Khalifa to the Imam Mahdi and Masih Maud, not a direct Khalifa to Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But because he himself is a Khalifa to him, so the process is linked, of course, but not in the manner that some people would have it.
I'm sorry, you have to answer, who is the Muslim? And the other Muslims are not and the other.
I believe, you see, I'm answering you, please wait for me. Number one, we never call non-Ahmadis as non-Muslims. I remind you of this, please, correct yourself. We always use the terminology. That is why in the beginning I cautioned you that it is your terminology. Ahmadiyya terminology is that we call non-Muslims only to those who call themselves non-Muslims. We call non-Ahmadis as non-Ahmadi Muslims. So we do not attribute anything to them which they do not profess. But they call us non-Muslims. While we believe in the holy founder of Islam, we believe in the Quran, they say because you also believe in Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian as a subordinate prophet, so you have ceased the right to be called a Muslim. We ask them, where is it written in the Holy Quran that such people who believe in Imam Mahdi or Masih Maud, they would cease the right to be Muslim. But whatever the argument, this is the difference. We never refer to non-Ahmadis as non-Muslims. Yesterday was a session of question-answer with non-Ahmadi Muslims. Today was a session for non-Muslims. But they told me that some non-Ahmadi Muslims could not make for the yesterday session, so I should be prepared, mentally prepared to receive them here as well. That is the reason why you are here, not as non-Muslim, please. Now tell me what you think of me. That is you think of me. Just thank you. Yes, I'm sorry, yes. His turn first, then we'll turn to you, please.
In the Holy Bible, the night before Jesus died, he prayed a prayer that they all may be one. Which you, Father, me and I, and you, that they also may be one, not so the world will believe that you have sent me. He prayed that prayer for unity. In our world today, we see a great deal of disunity within the same sex, different sex.
Yes.
As a member of the Islamic community, how do you see this unity being realized in our world of factualism today?
Right. Thank you very much. You see, I have been speaking on this subject throughout my tour of the world. Everywhere I go, I always take up this very important message we must give to the world. How can we live in disunity? How a unity can be forged out of disunity? My answer is twofold. One in relation to religion and the other in relation to politics. In relation to religion, I call to attention the people that the concept of unity of God is absolutely misunderstood by people who think that when you believe God is one somewhere in heaven or anywhere, that is all we have to believe. It's not so. It requires many more things. They automatically spring from this concept of unity. If you only partially believe in unity and do not extend the natural corollaries to the practical human relationship, then you are just living in a fool's dream that you believe in unity. I'll explain further. If God is one, all the universe is created by him. There should not be any contradiction. Neither in contradiction between universe nor a contradiction between his word and his act, that is the creation. Is that right or wrong? Right, of course. So when you see contradiction in religious scriptures, on the one hand, within them, and on the other, when you see contradiction between scriptures and nature, then you have to rethink about your belief in God. It's a very great dilemma. If God is one, if he is the creator, how could he create differently and tell different things to his dear ones, prophets and things? So there has to be something wrong, and that has to be resolved before we begin to understand the true meaning of unity. Again, the question of differences of religions in fundamentals. The Hindus believe in many gods. Of course, there are so many sects. Arya Samajis believe in just one God, but I'm talking of the majority. They bow to the idols they make themselves. They believe in the deity of sun and so on, like you have read in Roman mythology. The Christians believe in one God, but splittable into three as well. At the same time, three, at the same time one. This is the concept of Christian unity. The Jewish and Muslim concept of unity are united in the claim that God is one, insplittable and indivisible. Neither can be split into many, nor can be divided into smaller sections. Just one pure, simple one. Now, all claim to be from God. That is the dilemma. If there is a unity somewhere, somehow, the unity must be expressed, at least by God himself. How can we believe in that one God who turns to Krishna and tells him, I am so many, then in the second breath turns to Jesus and tells him, no, I am not so many, I am just three, and then turns to Prophet Muhammad and says, Moses was right, God is just one, no more. That is the dilemma. So there has to be something wrong with our concept of unity. Unless it is corrected, we will remain divided. Divided in the name of God. And that is the worst division that can take place. When you excite people to hate each other in the name of Allah, name of God, because you believe God to be different, then the entire world of religion becomes gory, with infights, with chaos, with disorder. We have to resolve the basics, the fundamental evils which result into this, and as I have attempted to demonstrate to you, our belief in the unity of God has to be re-examined everywhere, honestly, cool-mindedly, and with a sense of inquiry, like the scientists make an inquiry. Then gradually this unity will disappear and will be forged into unity, of course. So God would be one and religion would become one. An understanding of him would become, without that, talk of unity is meaningless. Secondly, when we read in certain religions that God revealed himself to that particular region and those particular people, no mention whatsoever is found of God's creature elsewhere. Whenever a mention is found, it is found with derision, with this sort of total disrespect. Like ignorant people, the Gentiles, this and that. But where is the God, the Creator, who created everybody? So the unity is again wrong. You believe in God and yet you say he only revealed himself to the people of the Middle East. Why did he create America? Why did he forget about people living here? Or China, or India, or other countries like Iran, Persia and Russia, so on and so forth. There has to be something wrong with that understanding of unity, which only chooses a particular people of a particular time for showing its love, and the rest are forgotten. So again, the world will remain divided. Now that is just a sample of how this unity begins to take shape, and how a serious attempt should be made to unify people in beliefs first. A true concept of unity is essential for the unification of mankind in religion. Now, talking of political unity or talking of politics, I believe that if there is one God, and the extension of the same argument leads us to believe that human problems can only be resolved with the principle of absolute justice. Because it is only absolute justice which treats the black and the white alike, the north and the south alike, the east and the west alike. This is the meaning of absolute justice. Where in politics of the world you find absolute justice today? They talk of unity, they talk of a new world order. From America we have heard voices, tall and big voices. A new world order is going to emerge. America would be the leader. How? When you are not ready to dispense absolute justice, how can you talk of peace? I take you back in time with reference to the Gulf crisis and American behavior. And in the name of God, who you mentioned, I'll ask you whether do you really believe that absolute justice was applied? That is it. So where is unity in politics? Unity in politics cannot be achieved without absolute justice. I give the example further, elaborate on the point. For 8 long years, Iraq fought with Iran, right? Estimated 1 million Iranians were killed during that atrocious war, and estimated 1 million Iraqis were killed. Iraq was fully supported throughout, financially by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and in arms and know-how of the warfare, it was fully supported mainly by America and by the rest of the allies as well. It was the West which taught Iraq how to make gas. It was the West which provided Iraq with the machinery to produce lethal gases. The lethal gases were used unchecked against the Iranians. They were shown on your televisions. No eye of a politician batted. No hair was turned here. Why did they not cry at the peak of their voices, "Come, public opinion of the world, what are you doing? Come and stop this nonsense"? Did you ever hear that voice? Never. 1/3 of Iran was almost taken over, and some of it was released, much larger area than Kuwait itself, just because of the necessity of war by Iraq recently. You know all that. Where was the word conscience? Where was the politics which speaks of absolute justice? Now the British also speak. I'm not against Americans, of course. I am for humanity. I'm against deviance. I'm against sectarianism. I'm against racialism. I'm against hatred, injustice. Wherever it is, I must point out. I say this is unjust, whether you are a friend of mine or not. Absolute justice requires that I point at the evil where I find evil. Call a spade, that is a simple formula. So I turn to the British, who have treated me so kindly that they have permitted me to work as temporary, to bring temporary headquarters in England and work there. I speak even against them. They have the generosity enough to tolerate this nonsense. Yet, I have to tell you the truth. You see, the Kurdish question. Now they talk tall of Saddam Hussein, the wicked, who treats Kurds like that. And You hear the Prime Minister of England, we have a right to go enter his country. We have a right to divide Iraq. We have a right to create a haven for the Kurds. What right has Saddam Hussein to perpetuate the slavery of the Kurds? Good talk, very interesting, very humane apparently. But let's turn back to the history. It was in the early 19th century, by the turn of this century, that the British created Kurdish problem. They divided the Kurds into 4 or 5 groups, I'll count them. Part of Kurds were handed over to Iraq, part of Kurds were handed over to Turkey, part of Kurds were handed over to Russia, part of Kurds were handed over to Syria. Iraq, of course, but Syria. They are divided in all these regions. And when the Kurds raised their voice against this cruelty and they attempted rebellion against the Iraqi yoke, for the first time in the recent history, they were gassed by the British. The leftover of the mustard gas of the First World War was used against the Kurds. And I'm speaking of British history, not my own personal imagination. In 1920, they were mercilessly killed en masse by the torturous death of being gassed. Then in 1922, they started demolishing villages after villages by one-sided bombardment, like the carpet bombing you have just witnessed. And they did not even have bullets. And the planes went close, destroying the villages, laying them to ground, destroying life altogether. It was so cruel that one of the most promising pilots who was tipped for being the next CNC in England, in British Air Force, resigned in protest. He said, "It's no more I can take." Such a beastly cruelty. Where was the Kurdish question then? Who was doing it? They were being enslaved by the British. Now when they have changed sides, Saddam Hussein appears as the evil, as the rascal, the one who, tramples upon the basic fundamental human rights of the Kurds. Why don't they go to free the Russian Kurds as well? Have they forgotten that they had scattered them into different parts? Why don't they confront Turkey, their solid ally? Why don't they attack Persia? Why don't the Iranian Kurds are there? And why don't they attack Syria as well? That is what I mean. The total want of absolute justice. So religiously you have a disunited concept of unity. Politically you speak of absolute justice and peace, and nowhere absolute justice is exercised by leaders in politics. Where could be the hope? The hope only lies in people like you, like ordinary humble people like me, to go on raising the voice, whatever the consequences, telling the whole world you're wrong, you have to rectify yourself. There is always goodness in man, and it's only that on which we can rely. Some people ask me to go start propaganda again. Okay, no, there is no way. We must reach the good in America. I know I have traveled here far and wide. I once came in '78 and did my camping here in America. I traveled more than 20,000 miles, met people at the grassroots. I know basically, except outside the cities, the American people are really good, loving, warm and genuine. They want genuine democracy. It's the leaders who distort the image of democracy later on. So what I mean and what I tell people, I say reach out to them. Tell them what is happening to them. What wrong is